What branch did you join?
Well, when I figured out that college wasn't working out so well for me, I tried to decide between the Coast Guard and the Navy. But I'm not much the fighting type, unless I'm arguing. So I decided the Coast Guard, and I decided that aviation electronics, because radios have always been my thing. So that's what I wanted to do. And so I tried to join the Coast Guard, and they said, yeah, sure, we'll take you. And then when I got out of the Coast Guard, I learned to fly planes, private planes, and I realized that the Army would pay for me to learn how to fly helicopters, because that's what I really like to do. In the Coast Guard, I flew in helicopters. So I also joined the Army National Guard to learn to fly helicopters, but I realized I couldn't do that and still keep a job. So I actually joined both the Coast Guard and the Army National Guard.
And how long were you in the Coast Guard?
4 years and 3 months. It was 4 years because that's the normal enlistment for the Coast Guard. And it was 3 months because my recruiter, well, I won't say lied to me, but he kind of misled me that there would be a school available for the aviation electronics that I wanted to do when I got out of boot camp. As it turned out, it was mistaken. It wasn't, and I had to wait a year, and then by the time the school was available, I had to add 3 months to my enlistment in order to still have the proper amount of time left for them to afford to put me through school. And then the Army National Guard is a year-by-year enlistment. So I just did 1 year, figured out I couldn't be away from work for 9 months to learn to fly helicopters, so total of 5 years and 3 months.
What was your favorite part when you joined?
When I joined, the initial joining is never fun. Everybody always has their stories of boot camp, how you have to march around and the things that they do to teach you to work as a team when you're not used to doing that. So that boot camp wasn't fun. When I got out of boot camp, instead of going to the school I wanted to go to, I went to Hawaii for a year. And because I was young and stupid, I didn't really take full advantage of that. It was still kind of fun, but I had a girlfriend back here in California, so the time in Hawaii I kept longing away. And I worked on aids to navigation, so we got to go to all the different islands and work on lighthouses and such. That was pretty fun. The real fun was after I got out of the aviation electronics school, and then I got to fly in C-130s and in helicopters, and became an air crewman and a search and rescue air crewman and an EMT. And that's how I got interested in medical equipment, which is, what I do now, is that I was an EMT, so I learned all the medical terminology and such. And I thought, wow, working on helicopters out on flight lines is real dirty and greasy and cold and nasty. Hospitals seemed like a much cleaner, much nicer place, a better environment. And I was mostly right. They're a better environment, but I wouldn't say necessarily cleaner. So when I was in the Coast Guard, the thing that I liked best was flying around in helicopters. I had the most flight time of anybody on the air station, because anytime somebody didn't want to go flying, go ask Fountain, he'll do it. I loved flying the helicopters, and you sit there with your feet hanging out of the door, watching the world come by. I was stationed in San Francisco, so we'd take off out of San Francisco, and it'd be cloudy and gray and nasty, miserable day. And then you break through the clouds, and then just the brightest white all around. It's just gorgeous. And that was regular flying. And then the things that I found most rewarding was when we go on search and rescues. And usually the weather wasn't very good on those. The best rescue I ever had was a couple of guys. Actually, it was 3 guys. Their boat had sunk in the middle of the night. And there was the captain, there was the old man in the sea, the real old guy, had been fisherman forever, and then there was a young guy. And we found the captain and the old guy had swum to a buoy out a couple miles out off of San Francisco Bay. They'd tied themselves to a buoy, and they were bouncing around on this buoy, freezing themselves because they had sunk at 1 o'clock in the morning, and we didn't find them till 3 o'clock the next afternoon. And it was just a pretty dramatic rescue because it's really tough to hoist people off of a buoy. You can't land next to it. So I got them both hoisted up, and I got them inside the helicopter and sat down and closed and cranked up the heat to warm them up. And it was the weirdest. It still raises the hair on my arm. It was the weirdest thing because instead of being really happy and glad to be rescued because they could have died, I found out that was when I found out there was a third person on the boat. And it turns out that the boat had only had 2 life vests. And the young guy knew how to swim. The old man in the sea had been a fisherman forever. He didn't know how to swim. So the young guy had given him his life vest and was just going to swim beside the guys, and they'd gotten separated in the night. And so the captain and the old man in the sea were both upset, worrying about what had happened to this guy. And after we got them to the hospital and landed, we took off again to head back out to see if we could find the young guy. One of the Coast Guard boats had already found his body. So it was really cool to have rescued them, but it was also sad that, one person didn't make it. So that's not exactly fun, but it was rewarding.
Did you make any friends? And if so, was there something you guys had in common?
The thing everybody in the military has in common is they hate the military. Whether it's the Coast Guard, the Army, the Navy, the Marines, PHS, the Health Service. But no, there were other things. So, we were all kind of electronic geeks, nerds. And so we had electronics in common. We all loved to go out there. And when you're young like that, I was in my early 20s, you think you're invincible, and you're not going to die, even though I actually lost some friends in the Coast Guard who went out. The Coast Guard official motto is Semper Paratus, which means always ready. Their unofficial motto, they told us, was you have to go out, but you don't have to come back. And I had one friend in particular who went out off of Maine in a helicopter, a much bigger helicopter than the ones we flew in, and they never did find his body. So it was a real thing that you could go out and not come back. Of course, I always said, I'm not going out if I'm not coming back, and it worked for me, so I'm pretty happy about that. There were several people. There was one guy in particular, Ron Petrosky. I'll never forget him. He's a great guy. We kind of kept in touch after the Coast Guard for a little bit. But I learned a lot of stuff from him. He was an amazingly controlled guy. He wouldn't sweat. We were stationed in North Carolina in the summertime where it's a bajillion degrees and 750% humidity, and everything would be sweat. We'd go out on a bike ride. We'd come back. The guy wouldn't be sweating. He claimed it was a lack of self-control if you let yourself sweat. But he was a terrific guy. There were several other people like that. You just, when you're part of a team like that, you develop a relationship because you've got to put your life in somebody else's hands. You're not doing it by yourself. Nobody does anything by themselves. And in the military, in fire departments, in police, they all have to create a special bond that puts them together. So, yeah, even veterans that I know that are veterans, even if I didn't know them in the Coast Guard or the Army National Guard, there's a bond there because we understand that boot camp, work as a team relationship.
What challenges did you have to face?
Oh, yeah. Well, those people I talk about that are on a team? Yeah, well, it's the same thing as in the rest of life. You put your life in their hands, but just like with your kids, you love them to death, but sometimes you want to kill them. That was a challenge that was often there, is trying not to kill each other. As far as the actual job in the Coast Guard of going out and rescuing people, those challenges were, there's a way that you do things, there's a procedure, there's a process, and you need to stick to that process. And if you do, then things will generally come out okay. And the challenge is practicing that process until it's second nature, so that you're just going to do these things. I was thinking about it just today. The way I used to take weather reports, I would write them down and I would use slashes and double slashes to mean different things. I still do that today when I'm writing my reports and working on the equipment and taking notes. So I guess those processes became just part of everyday life. And lots of stuff like that. There are also the regular challenges of just, keeping warm, flying out in a storm, flying in the middle of the night. We once flew, it was a storm in 79. Back in 79 in the old days. To you, that's old. To me, that's not old. But it was a storm in '79, and we'd been flying all day trying to rescue people and put things straight. And it was pitch black. The wind was blowing at a good 80 knots coming into San Francisco Bay. And we had just flown over the Golden Gate Bridge, and we're trying to make headway. And after a bit, we couldn't make headway anymore. We're just flying 80 knots into the wind, and we're getting nowhere. Hovering at 80 knots. That was bad. So it was time to turn around and go home. We wouldn't have been able to see anybody anyway. The problem is, here's the bridge. We're on this side of it. You can't see the bridge. You're hovering at 80 knots. When you go to turn around, you're going to be immediately flying at 160 knots. You've got to make sure you're above the bridge and other things like that. That's a challenge for the pilot. All I had to do was put my trust in him that he was good enough that we weren't going to crash into the bridge. That's really a bad day. That's called a bad flight. Any flight that you walk away from, that's a good flight. Smash into a bridge, you're probably not walking away.
Did you ever get in trouble and have consequences?
Well, now remember, I was early 20s, so the male of the species in the early 20s, if they're awake, the odds of getting into mischief, let's not say trouble, let's say mischief, are pretty high. As far as consequences, my most mischievous thing was trying to show the guys in the barracks how they could take the smoke head out of the fire alarm system and nothing would happen. Except when I did that, something did happen. The fire alarm went off. And they would really frown on that. Because remember, this was the late 70s. There was a lot more weed going around than you might have otherwise expected. So guys were always trying to do that. Not me, because I'm a nerd, but I was trying to impress them with my nerdy skills by being able to take care of this fire alarm system. Yeah. And I was able to put it back together so they couldn't figure out who it was, because normally the lights light, and I rigged it. Of course, I was standing out there as the fire truck was there, and everybody's standing around, and some smart aleck from our barracks came over and said, "All right, Fountain, we know you did it." It wasn't for real. It scared the bejeebers out of me. That was about the worst circumstance. So actually, that's pretty nerdy.
Why did you join the Coast Guard?
Well, like I said, I went straight from high school into college, and I hadn't paid a lot of attention in high school. Hadn't attended some classes, that sort of thing. I was apparently bright enough to be able to get by without doing that and still pass. But when you get to college, it's a little different. You really need to go to the classes if you expect to learn things. So my first semester, I didn't do well, and there were personal things going on in my life. So I wanted to escape, and that was what I saw as the quickest escape. And then I reasoned it out, because college is expensive, that if I went into the military, at that time the GI benefit was pretty good, and they would pay me to go to college. So I figured I'd spend 4 years, I learned electronics, I'd be able to have a job, and I could go to school, and the military would pay for it. And that's what I eventually did. So when I got out, I went back to college. Now I paid attention, and I did quite well in college, and finally graduated with a bachelor's degree, and was able to work, got the job that I've been doing for the last 7 years. And so it worked out pretty well. That's all. Well, thank you very much. You've been a very nice interviewer.